The pressure didn't just stay on, it multiplied. Because this wasn't a quiet disagreement anymore. This wasn't a comment buried in a thread. This was public, direct, and impossible to ignore. A YouTuber versus one of the most powerful hypercar manufacturers on the planet. And for the second time, Matt Armstrong stepped forward and called them out. Not with emotion, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Receipts. It started with something nobody expected. A response, not from a fan, not from a critic, but from the very top, the CEO himself. Just imagine that shift for a second. 5 years ago, Matt was rebuilding cars in a restaurant parking lot. No factory backing, no million-dollar equipment, just tools, determination, and a camera. Now, the head of a billion-dollar hypercar empire is watching his videos and responding to them. That alone tells you something changed. Because companies like Bugatti don't respond unless they feel something. Pressure, exposure, or risk. And Matt knew exactly what this moment meant. But instead of turning it into drama, he did something smarter. He stayed calm. He made it clear from the start, this isn't personal. This isn't about attacking a brand. This is about one thing only. Getting a broken car back on the road. That's it. No politics. No ego. Just a rebuild. But what came next started to unravel everything. Because once Matt began addressing claims, the cracks started to show. Big ones. The first issue seemed simple on the surface. Headlights. A rumor had been floating around that Bugatti Chiron headlights cost around $150,000. The CEO pushed back on that. Said it wasn't true. Said the real price was closer to $20,000. And on paper, that sounds reasonable. Still expensive, but understandable for a hypercar. But Matt exposed the real problem. He can't buy them. Not for $150,000. Not for $20,000. Not at all. Bugatti simply refuses to sell in the parts. So the only option he has is the secondary market. And that's where the $150,000 quote came from. Which means the real issue isn't the price. It's access. Because a $20,000 headlight might as well be worth $1 million if you're not allowed to buy it. And that's where the argument starts to fall apart. Because Bugatti claims this is about safety. But if safety was truly the priority, wouldn't you want the correct parts being used? Wouldn't you make sure the person rebuilding the car has access to the exact components it was designed with? Instead, the system pushes him toward unknown alternatives, unverified sources, parts that may or may not meet factory standards. That's not improving safety. That's increasing risk. And Matt didn't have to say it aggressively. The logic speaks for itself. Then came the bigger moment, the one that changed everything. Airbags. Because this is where Bugatti leaned heavily into their argument. Precision engineering, advanced calibration, temperature-based deployment testing. They painted a picture of something incredibly complex. Something that only they could control. Something that absolutely could not be replicated outside their ecosystem. And then Matt did something simple. He checked the part numbers. What he found raised serious questions. Because according to him, the airbag system in the Chiron appears to match components used in a standard Audi A3. Same part numbers. Same mounting points. Same physical design. Now think about that for a second. If that's true, then the entire argument about bespoke, irreplaceable safety systems starts to weaken. Because suddenly, we're not talking about a one-of-a-kind component. We're talking about something shared across the Volkswagen Group. Something used in everyday vehicles. And Matt didn't claim perfection. He didn't pretend to have factory-level testing. He said something far more grounded. If he can use genuine OEM parts, the same parts a car was built with, then the system should behave exactly as intended. That's not reckless. That's logical. But again, he can't get those parts. And that brings us back to the same issue. Control. Because the more you look at it, the less this feels like a safety argument. And the more it starts to feel like something else entirely. Then came the point that really shifted the narrative. The legal classification of the car itself. In the United States, when a car is severely damaged, it gets one of two outcomes. Either it's declared a total loss beyond repair, or it's given a rebuild title. That distinction matters a lot, because a certificate of destruction means the car is finished forever. It cannot legally return to the road. A rebuild title means the opposite. It means a car can be repaired, inspected, and driven again. And who determines that? A certified inspection, often involving manufacturer input. In this case, Bugatti's own technician evaluated the car, and they did not declare it destroyed. They gave it a rebuild title, which means, at that moment, according to Bugatti's own process, the car was considered repairable, safe enough to return to the road, if fixed correctly. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If the car was safe enough to be rebuilt, why is it suddenly too dangerous to rebuild independently? That contradiction is hard to ignore, because you can't have it both ways. You can't allow a car to be sold publicly as repairable and then argue that no one outside your network should attempt to repair it. That's not a safety standard. That's a restriction. And that's where the conversation starts to expand beyond just one car. Because Matt brought up something that few people talk about. What other hypercar manufacturers do in this situation? Some brands don't allow the scenario to happen at all. When one of their cars crashes, they step in, they buy it back, they take control of the vehicle, they repair it themselves, or remove it from circulation entirely. Not because they can't sell parts, but because they don't want the risk. They don't want the uncertainty. They don't want their brand attached to something they didn't oversee. And that's a valid strategy. It's expensive, but it's consistent. Bugatti didn't do that. They let the car go to auction. They allowed it to be purchased publicly. They didn't intervene. They didn't buy it back. They didn't stop it from leaving their control. And that decision matters. Because once it's out there, the responsibility shifts. If you truly believe the car should never be rebuilt, you don't let it be sold. You don't leave that door open. But they did. And now that someone has walked through that door, they are trying to close it behind them. That's the tension. That's the conflict. And it's not going away. Because while all of this is happening, the rebuild continues. The car is stripped down to its core. Carbon fiber exposed. Structural damage visible. Radiators crushed. Mounts broken. Panels destroyed. This isn't a cosmetic job. This is deep, complex, and uncertain. At one point, Matt mentions needing to split the car in half to access the gearbox. A process that, according to Bugatti, only a handful of facilities in the world can do correctly. And Matt's response is going to try. Because not trying guarantees failure. Trying at least creates a possibility. And that's what this entire project represents. Not perfection. Not certainty. Possibility. And that's why people are watching. Because this isn't just about one car anymore. It's about a bigger question. Who controls the future of repair? The manufacturers? Or the people willing to learn, attempt, and document the process? Matt even offered a solution. A reasonable one. Sell the parts. Remove the warranty. Transfer all liability to the builder. Walk away clean. Other manufacturers do it. Some even go further. There have been cases where cars rebuilt independently were later inspected, approved, and even had warranties reinstated. So the system can work. There is a middle ground, but only if both sides are willing to meet there. Right now, that's not happening. And that's why this story keeps growing. Because every new detail adds another layer. Every response raises another question. Every attempt pushes the boundary a little further. And somewhere in the middle of all this, a broken hypercar sits in a workshop in Miami, waiting, piece by piece, being brought back, not with factory support, not with corporate approval, but with determination, and a camera, and millions of people watching, wondering how far this can go. Because if this works, it changes everything. And if it doesn't, it still proves something just as powerful, that the attempt itself matters, that the challenge matters, that pushing against impossible odds still has value. And maybe that's why the situation feels so different. Because it's not just a rebuild anymore. It's a confrontation between two worlds. Precision versus persistence. Control versus curiosity. And neither side is backing down. The only question left is, what happens when the impossible starts to look possible? Title: Matt Armstrong versus Bugatti Round 2. The truth they didn't want you to see. Thumbnail idea: left side, Matt holding a broken Chiron part. Shocked expression right side. Bugatti CEO serious face center text. Big, bold, they responded. Again, small bottom text. This changes everything. And just when it felt like the situation couldn't escalate any further, it did. Because something subtle started happening in the background, something most people miss on the first watch. The narrative began to shift. Not from Matt, not from Bugatti, but from the audience. Car enthusiasts, engineers, mechanics, even casual viewers who had never touched a span in their lives. They all started asking the same question. If this really is about safety, why does it look so much like control? That question didn't come from emotion. It came from observation. Because the deeper people looked into the details, the more patterns began to appear. And those patterns didn't line up neatly with the official explanation. Take the part situation again. This isn't just about headlights or airbags in the mall. It's about an entire ecosystem that decides who is allowed to fix a car and who isn't. Modern hypercars aren't just machines. They're networks, locked systems, encrypted modules, components that don't just bolt on, they communicate. And if one part doesn't recognize another, the whole system can refuse to function. That's not accidental. That's design. And in many ways, it makes sense. These cars operate at extreme levels of performance. Tiny errors can have massive consequences. Manufacturers want control over that. They want consistency. They want certainty. But here's where it gets complicated. Because when that control extends beyond engineering and into ownership, that's when people start pushing back. Because once you buy something, especially something worth millions, the expectation is simple. It's yours. To drive, to modify, to repair, to restore. But what happens when ownership doesn't include access? What happens when you own the car, but not the ability to fix it? That's the tension sitting underneath this entire story. And Matt, whether intentionally or not, has become the person exposing it in real time. Every obstacle he faces isn't just a technical challenge. It's a demonstration, a real-world example of what happens when independent repair meets manufacturer restriction. And the Chiron just happens to be the most extreme version of that conflict. Because this isn't a normal car. This is one of the most advanced machines ever put on the road. A car engineered with tolerances so tight that even minor misalignments can cause major issues. A car designed not just to perform, but to perform flawlessly. And that's exactly why Bugatti is so protective of it. But protection can start to look like prevention. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because now the question isn't just about this rebuild. It's about the future. If a skilled builder with resources, knowledge, and global support still can't access parts, what does that mean for everyone else? What does it mean for smaller shops? Independent mechanics? Owners who don't live near authorized service centers? Suddenly, this isn't a niche issue anymore. It's a direction, a glimpse into where the industry could be heading. And that's why people are paying attention. Because Matt isn't just rebuilding a car. He's testing a boundary. And every time he finds a workaround, every time he sources a part, every time he solves a problem without factory help, that boundary shifts. Just a little. Then there's another layer to this, one that's harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Reputation. For brands like Bugatti, reputation is everything. Not just performance, not just luxury, but perfection. Every car represents a brand. Every detail reflects their standards. So the idea of a Chiron being rebuilt outside their control, that's not just a technical concern. That's a brand risk. Because if something goes wrong, if the car fails, if there's an issue down the line, people won't separate the rebuild from a brand. They'll just see the badge. And that fear is real. But here's the contradiction. If the rebuild succeeds, if the car returns to the road, if it performs as it should, then what? Because that outcome challenges a narrative. It proves that independent rebuilds, when done carefully, methodically, and transparently, can work. And that's a powerful statement. Maybe too powerful, because it opens doors. It creates precedent. It gives others the confidence to try. And that's something manufacturers can't fully control. Which brings us back to Matt. Because through all of this, he hasn't changed his approach. He's still doing what he's always done. Documenting everything. Showing the failures. Admitting what he doesn't know. Learning in real time. That authenticity is what makes this different. Because this isn't hidden behind corporate messaging. This is raw, unfiltered, And that's why it resonates. Because people trust what they can see. They trust the process, even when it's messy, even when it's uncertain. And right now, it's very uncertain. The deeper the rebuild goes, the more complex it becomes. Structural integrity, electronic systems, cooling architecture, transmission access. Each step introduces new variables, new risks, new unknowns, and yet the progress continues. Slowly, carefully, relentlessly, because stopping isn't an option. Not anymore. Not after everything that's been said. Not after the attention this has gained. Not after the lines that have been drawn. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because we're no longer at the beginning of the story. We're in the middle, where outcomes are still undecided, where both sides are still holding their ground, where every new development could shift the balance. And somewhere ahead, there's an ending, one where the car either drives again, or it doesn't, one where the rebuild either proves a point, or reinforces a warning. But regardless of how it ends, something has already changed, because this conversation is now out in the open, about ownership, about access, about who gets to decide what happens to a machine after it leaves a factory. And that conversation isn't going away. Not after this. Not after millions of people have seen what's happening. Not after the questions that have been raised. Because once people start asking those questions, they don't just forget them. They carry them forward, into the next car, the next purchase, the next decision. And maybe that's the real impact of this entire saga. Not just whether one Chiron gets rebuilt, but whether this moment shifts how people think about the cars they own. Because in the end, this was never just about one rebuild. It was about something much bigger. And it's still unfolding. Right now, with every bolt removed, every part sourced, every challenge faced, the story continues. Unfinished, unresolved, and more intense than ever. Because the pressure isn't going anywhere. If anything, it's just getting started. And just when it feels like every angle has already been explored, another layer reveals itself. Because now, something even more interesting is happening, not in the workshop, not in the boardroom, but in perception. The way people see the story is changing. At first, it looked like a simple rebuild. Then it became a controversy. Now, it's turning into a case study. A real-time experiment playing out in front of millions. Because what Matt is doing isn't just mechanical anymore. It's philosophical. He's challenging an idea. The idea that complexity automatically means exclusivity. That just because something is difficult, it must be restricted. And that's a powerful idea to question. Because history shows something very different. Every time technology becomes more advanced, it starts off controlled, closed, understood by only a few. But over time, people learn. They adapt. They reverse engineer. They figure things out. And what once seemed impossible becomes normal. That's how progress works. But only if someone is willing to take the first step. And right now, that's exactly what we're watching. A first step into territory that most people wouldn't even consider attempting. Because let's be honest, this isn't just risky. It's intimidating. Every component on that car carries consequences. Every decision matters. Every shortcut could turn into a failure. And the margin for error? Almost non-existent. Which is exactly why most people wouldn't try. But Matt did. And that decision alone is what separates this project from everything else. Because he's not operating with guarantees. He's operating with questions. Can this be fixed? Can these systems work outside factory control? Can knowledge replace restriction? And with every episode, he's answering those questions, one piece at a time. But there's something else that's quietly building alongside this. Momentum. Because the more progress he makes, the harder it becomes to dismiss the effort. At the beginning, it was easy to doubt, easy to say it wouldn't work, easy to assume the project would stall. But now, there's evidence, visible progress, real steps forward, and that changes how people react. Doubt turns into curiosity. Curiosity turns into support, and support turns into pressure. Because now, it's not just Matt pushing forward. It's an audience watching, analyzing, and forming opinions. And those opinions matter, especially in a world where perception shapes reputation. Because every move from this point on is being judged, not just by viewers, but by the industry itself. Other manufacturers are watching. Other builders are watching. Even people inside these companies are watching. Because whether they admit it or not, this situation affects them too. If one boundary gets pushed successfully, others might follow. And that's how change starts. Not with a single moment, but with a series of small, undeniable shifts. And right now, we're in the middle of one. Then there's the emotional side of this, something that often gets overlooked. Because behind all the technical debates, the legal discussions, the brand strategies, there's still a human element. Frustration, determination, pride. Because imagine putting everything into a project like this, only to be told, indirectly, that you shouldn't even try. That no matter how careful you are, no matter how methodical your process is, you'll never meet the standard. That's not just a technical barrier. That's a psychological one. And breaking through that takes more than skill. It takes resilience. And that's something you can't manufacture. You either have it or you don't. And Matt clearly does. Because he keeps going. Even when the path isn't clear. Even when the next step isn't obvious. Even when the odds aren't in his favor. And that persistence is what keeps this story alive. Because people don't just watch success. They watch effort. They watch struggle. They watch the process. And right now, the process is everything. Because the ending hasn't been written yet. And that uncertainty, that's what keeps people coming back. Because every new update carries weight. Every small win feels significant. Every setback feels real. And somewhere in between those moments, the bigger picture continues to form. A picture that raises a question the industry can't ignore forever. What happens when knowledge becomes more accessible than control? Because once enough people understand how something works, restriction becomes harder to justify. And that's not a threat. That's evolution. But evolution doesn't happen quietly. It happens through moments like this. Moments where someone steps outside the expected path and refuses to turn back. And whether you agree with him or not, whether you think this rebuild should happen or shouldn't, one thing is certain. It's happening, right now, in real time, with every challenge still ahead, with every risk still present, with everything still on the line. And maybe that's why this story feels different, because it's not polished, it's not controlled, it's not predictable, it's raw, unfolding, uncertain, and real, which means one thing. We're not just watching a rebuild, we're watching a moment that could redefine what's possible, or reinforce why limits exist in the first place. Either way, it matters, because when this is all over, when the tools are put down, when the final piece is in place, when the engine either starts or stays silent, there will be an answer, not just about the car, but about everything surrounding it. And until that moment comes, the tension remains, the pressure builds, and the story continues, unfinished, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. And in the end, it all comes down to a single moment. Not the arguments, not the statements, not the back and forth between a creator and a corporation. Just one moment, a key in the ignition, a machine that was once written off, sitting still, waiting, because everything leads here. Every late night in the workshop, every part that couldn't be sourced, every workaround, every doubt, every voice saying it couldn't be done, all of it builds toward that one question. Will it start? And if it does, that sound won't just be an engine coming to life. It will be proof. Proof that persistence can challenge precision, that access doesn't always define ability, that sometimes the impossible just hasn't been attempted long enough. But if it doesn't, if the silence remains, that won't be failure. It will be something just as powerful. A line drawn clearly. A reminder of how far engineering has gone and how tightly it's now held. Either outcome means something. Either outcome changes something. Because this was never just about fixing a car. It was about challenging an idea. An idea about who gets to decide what's possible. And whether that decision belongs only to those who build, or also to those willing to rebuild. Somewhere in Miami, that answer is getting closer. With every bolt tightened, with every system tested, with every risk taken, the world is watching, not for perfection, but for truth. Because when that moment finally comes, when the outcome is no longer a question, this story won't just end. It will echo across workshops, across manufacturers, across every person who's ever looked at something broken and wondered if it could live again. And maybe that's the real legacy of all this. Not just whether one Chiron returns to the road, but whether this moment inspires others to try, to question, to push, to build, even when they are told not to. Because progress doesn't ask for permission. It shows up one attempt at a time. And right now, we're witnessing one of those attempts. Unfiltered, uncontrolled, and unforgettable. So when the dust settles, when the debate fades, when the cameras finally stop rolling, only one thing will matter. Not who was right, but what became possible. And that is something no one can take away. And even after that moment, even after the key turns and the outcome is revealed, the story doesn't really end. Because moments like this don't just disappear. They leave a mark on the people watching, on the industry observing, and on the unspoken rules that quietly shape what's allowed and what isn't. Because long after the cameras are off, there will still be conversations, in workshops, in boardrooms, behind closed doors where decisions are made. Questions will linger, not loud, not public, but persistent. What if this becomes more common? What if others follow the same path? What if control starts slipping, not all at once, but piece by piece? And maybe, somewhere, that thought is already being considered. Because disruption rarely arrives as a wave. It starts as a crack, small, easy to dismiss, until it spreads, and whether this rebuild succeeds completely or falls short in some way, that crack already exists. Because the attempt happened, the process was shown, the limitations were tested in front of everyone, and that transparency, that's something you can't undo. You can't put that back behind closed doors. People have seen too much. They've seen what's possible. They've seen what's difficult. And most importantly, they've seen what's being restricted. And once people understand that difference, they don't look at things the same way again. That's a quiet shift happening beneath all of this. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Because the next time someone buys a car like this, they might ask different questions. Not just about speed, not just about performance, but about ownership, about access, about what happens if something goes wrong. And those questions matter because they shape decisions, and decisions shape the future. So maybe the real ending isn't a dramatic reveal. Maybe it's something quieter, something that unfolds over time, a gradual change in how people think, how they approach problems, how they define what's possible. And maybe, years from now, this moment will be looked back on differently, not as a controversy, not as a clash, but as a turning point, a moment where someone stepped outside the expected path and showed what happens when you keep going anyway. Because that's what this really is. Not rebellion, not defiance, but curiosity in motion, the kind that doesn't accept limits at face value. The kind that asks one more question, and then one more after that. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change something. So as everything settles, as the noise fades, as the outcome becomes just another part of the story, one thing remains. This wasn't ordinary. This wasn't predictable. And it definitely wasn't forgettable. Because whether it ends in triumph or in lessons learned, it already achieved something bigger. It made people look closer, think deeper, and question more. And once that starts, it doesn't stop. Not here, not with this car, not with this story. Because somewhere out there, someone else is watching, learning, getting ready to try something they were told couldn't be done. And when they do, this moment will be part of that decision. Quietly, powerfully, unavoidably. And that's how real change begins. Not with permission, but with someone willing to begin anyway.